My name is Patrick Agney. I have a doctorate in clinical psychology, and I am a diagnosed sociopath. This is everything I'm authorized to tell you. People like to believe that sociopaths are one-dimensional serial killers because, in a way, if every sociopath looks like that, then sociopaths would be easy to spot. You won't have to worry whether you're married to one or living next door to one or having birthed one, when the truth is most sociopaths resemble normal people. It's a really complex and layered question because the term sociopath is no longer used clinically. But if you're looking at it through that lens, that the classic sociopath is someone who struggles to understand the learned social emotions. So everyone has like a sort of hardwired set of emotions. These are the inherent emotions: happiness, sadness, etc. But there is another set of emotions that are learned. These are things like empathy, compassion, shame, remorse. We are taught these things mostly through modeling by caregivers. Sociopaths struggle to learn those emotions. There's been a lot of talk about the sociopathic mask and how sociopaths mask in order to charm and commit harm, when in reality, we mask for the same reasons that everyone else masks. It's easier to get through life if you are acting like everyone else does. I am masking right now. If I wasn't, I would have a much flatter affect. I wouldn't be as friendly perceiving, which isn't to say that I would be mean or that I would want to harm you or anyone in this studio, but I would probably be blinking less. I wouldn't be as engaging. But again, I think this is very relatable. I was very problematic for teachers in elementary school in particular, because whereas at home I worked pretty hard to fly under the radar and not cause any problems, I didn't do that so much at school. I got in trouble a lot. As a child, I felt this emotional claustrophobia. And the only way that I was able to neutralize that claustrophobia was to act out in a way that was destructive. I don't know why. I just knew, do this and you'll feel better. When I was in elementary school in San Francisco, there was a little girl that I was friends with, and I remember the day that I attacked this child. I had been feeling tremendous pressure. And on this particular day, I had been engaging in small acts of deviance in order to sort of neutralize the pressure, and it hadn't been working. And there was a child who was standing next to me and provoking me in a way that shouldn't have mattered. And I just remember feeling the impulse to hurt her. And so I grabbed a pencil out of my backpack and I stabbed her with it. And I knew that it was wrong. But again, I understood this intellectually, not emotionally. But what was the most troublesome for me was when I stabbed this child, not only did the pressure I was experiencing at the time go away, but it was replaced by a type of euphoria. It was almost like being high. I did it, and then I walked away, and I walked home, and it just felt so good. But it wasn't the harming of another child that felt good. It was the euphoria that it elicited. That sounds crazy in the sense that harming someone else made me feel good. But it wasn't the act of harming another child. It was the act of doing something very destructive. This kid was in the wrong place at the wrong time. I grew up just outside of San Francisco, and my upbringing was really normal, although I hate to use that word. I did, however, grow up during a time where we hardly had words for anxiety and depression, much less sociopathy. My parents did the best they could, but they weren't equipped to deal with a child like me. And I would imagine most parents aren't. And my father was in the music business, so he was very charming and outgoing. My mother was a traditional, perfect homemaker from the South. I would listen to my mother say to my sister, you want to get good grades. You want to make your teacher happy, right? And I remember watching my sister, oh yes, I definitely, you don't want your teacher to be upset at you. And no, I don't want my teacher to be upset. And I remember listening to this conversation and thinking, I don't really care what my teacher thinks or if she's happy or sad. And I also understood that saying that was not a great idea. That when I was asked, I should just nod and open my eyes really wide like my sister does and say, yes, no, I don't want my teacher to be mad at me. And admitting to that gets me in trouble for no other reason than because it's not how I'm, quote unquote, supposed to feel. So I learned to lie and manipulate other people's reactions very early, again, not because I was trying to hurt others, but because I was just trying to go unnoticed. Anytime I was honest with someone about the way that I was really feeling, it was always met with judgment and a lot of times anger and frustration. So I learned to lie as a protective mechanism. And over time, that developed into just a maladaptive lifestyle strategy. I believe that I am one of those kids with that inherent manipulative temperament, which sort of predisposed me to a higher likelihood of being antisocial, but I can't point to any specific trauma. I do know that having a dad in the music business and watching him sort of navigate and be charming, I think I learned very early that I don't really need emotion. I can just do what he does, which is smile and be affable and you get what you want. But I can't speak to a specific environmental cause. I knew from a very young age that I wanted to live in a nice house and I wanted to have a relationship and I wanted to have a family, but I also understood that the only way for me to get those things would be to interact pro-socially with other people. It is beneficial to me to act pro-socially, so I do. My childhood was spent masking. I was just trying to survive. But over time, it became really exhausting. And what I try to remind people who are resistant to the idea of helping sociopaths, I try to remind them, these people at one point were all children. Wouldn't you want to help a child? And of course, the answer is always yes. Constructive behavior typically elicits a dopamine release that I don't get. So doing something quote unquote kind, I don't feel that attaboy, that pride. It's more matter of fact. There was someone in the grocery store who didn't have the money to pay for their groceries. So I paid for the groceries for this person behind me. And then I left the store. I wasn't doing it because I wanted any credit or this is a problem that needs to be solved, so I'm going to solve it for this person. But I don't get that hit of, wow, what a good person I am. That was a nice thing to do. But I do get it from something destructive. I get this jolt of feeling that sort of snaps me out of my pressure. In much the same way that someone who has obsessive compulsive disorder, they can't tell you why washing their hands 8 times or doing a series of rituals makes them feel less anxiety. It just does. And that was similar to what I was experiencing as a child. When I was a kid, I was at a sleepover and I decided to walk home in the middle of the night, which I understand is not a typical choice. And on that walk home, there was someone who had left their garage open in my neighborhood. And I went into the garage and I actually got in the car that was in the garage. And I remember feeling so much peace. It was existing in a world where I knew I wasn't supposed to exist. It really neutralized the pressure that I had been feeling that day. As I got older, breaking into homes was my sort of go-to for neutralizing the pressure that I would feel. And I never took anything, and I never did anything destructive within the home. It didn't matter to me whether it was a huge house, small house, an occupied house. I started to lean more toward houses that weren't occupied for obvious reasons, but I found some regular places that I liked and I felt that I could get in and out of safely, and I would just sit in the silence and I could feel all the pressure going away and all of the apathy flooding in, which is not, I don't believe that's normal. I think that when most neurotypical people find themselves in a house where they're not supposed to be, they're going to be anxious about it. Their heart's going to be racing. It was the exact opposite for me. And what I came to realize is, this is how I want to feel. This, I don't care. I don't care, and it's okay. It's okay to feel apathetic. It's okay to just have no emotion, to just sort of float. And what I found was that these regular acts of disciplined deviance helped prevent more spontaneous acts. And that was always a concern for me, particularly after I had stabbed the little girl in my class. If I waited too long, there was a possibility that I might not lose control, but resort to something more extreme. And I never wanted to be at the mercy of these compulsions. So as I got older, I started to engage in them almost like a prescription. I would do it whether I felt like it or not, just to keep the pressure at a manageable space there, so there wouldn't be any spikes. I did this for years. I mean, I like to joke that some people microdose mushrooms, whereas I like to microdose mischief.
You also stole cars. Was that the same general feeling?
Yes, it was exactly the same. And there was never any damage, or there was never any like super destructive driving or anything like that. It was existing someplace I wasn't supposed to exist. And I figured I was dancing a fine line of was it wrong, in the sense that everyone whose cars I took, I engaged with in some way, and they were usually inebriated. So in the back of my head, I felt like for some reason I got pulled over or busted for this. I would have a very logical explanation. I have the guy's keys. He gave them to me. I don't understand what the problem is. Over time, I realized that doing that required a very specific set of circumstances. It required interacting with people to get the keys, and it was too much work. I just wanted to be able to get my hit, so to speak, without having to go through, without having to go to a party, without having to time it. It was a lot more work. It wasn't a moral choice. It was a selfish choice. I remember thinking, my luck will run out. If I continue to do this, if I escalate, I will end up in jail, and I don't want to go to jail. There are other things that I want to do. I always felt very much as if I was floating in outer space. It was just this abyss, and I didn't know how far my lack of emotion would take me. And also, because I saw sociopathy associated with monsters, there was a long time where I remember thinking, so is this just what happens? Like, I don't feel like a monster, but am I going to wake up one day and suddenly want to kill people? It was scary. I was really relieved when I got the diagnosis, which is not something I think a neurotypical person would experience. But when I've spoken to others like me recently, I found that with them it was the same. I was relieved to get this diagnosis. I was relieved to see myself in your story, because I've always felt that there was something off, and now I had a name for it. And I also knew that I wasn't alone. There were at least enough people out there like me to justify a psychological disorder. Towards maybe the end of college, I had a conversation with my dad where I came very clean about the way that I was not feeling and the things that I was doing. And it was his suggestion that I see a therapist who did a clinical assessment on me, and then I was given the PCL. And that the score of that PCL is what determined the actual diagnosis. The PCL is the psychopathic checklist revised. It's the gold standard testing for psychopathy. The DSM is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. It's the psychological Bible, so to speak. It's what clinicians use for most diagnoses, and it's what insurance companies use in terms of coding and how to pay for the treatment. In order to diagnose someone with antisocial personality disorder, you use the DSM. And this is someone whose behavior is the huge driving force. You're going to see a lot of impulse control issues. They don't really respond to punishment or correction at all. It's the same behavior over and over again. In order to diagnose someone as a sociopath or a psychopath, you cannot use the DSM. For that, you have to use the PCL. So although these disorders have a tremendous amount of overlap and are roughly the same, they're different in that they require different measures for diagnosis. If something isn't in the DSM, that means it doesn't exist. When that's not true, there are many disorders that aren't in the DSM because they need a more complex measure to test. I'm pretty sure sex addiction isn't in the DSM. Looking at the behavioral markers for sociopathy and thinking, who says all sociopaths act like this? Who says that you're saying that all sociopaths are irresponsible, all sociopaths demonstrate criminal versatility, all sociopaths are incapable of impulse control? Well, I'm capable of impulse control, and I'm sure that I'm not alone. I'm capable of being responsible. I demonstrate criminal versatility, but you don't know that. I'm telling you that. If you don't have proof of it, how would you know? And so I was coming to it from a space of, we should be talking more about what's going on psychologically, and we should be spending less time talking about behavior, because not every person who has this personality disorder is acting in the exact same way. In order to sit for the PCL, it is a requirement to have a criminal record. And what that says to me is you're making a generalized statement about this group. If you are only testing people who have a criminal record, you're going to miss all of those who are sitting on the mild to moderate side of the spectrum who do not have a criminal record, myself included. Now, there is a different version of the PCL called the PCL-SV, which is given to those who do not have criminal records. But the fact that there are two different versions of the same test, I feel, is potentially problematic. And if you're only testing within the prison system, for the most part, your results are going to be far more conservative. My therapist's primary goal was getting the behavior under control and figuring out better coping mechanisms to deal with what we ultimately understood was anxiety related to this pressure that I was feeling. So we approached it that way, like, let's treat the anxiety, and that's what she did, and it seemed to be really effective. But for me, understanding the motivation behind my behavior was secondary to stopping the behavior. So at the time that I was in therapy, at first, I was engaging in a lot of destructive behavior, and that needed to stop in order for me to start learning about my motivations and develop new, more positive coping mechanisms, which is what we did, my therapist and me. In my experience, a combination of cognitive behavioral therapy, which is behavioral based, and talk therapy was really effective. But it was sort of trial and error. There was no standard treatment plan. There is still no standard treatment plan, which is wild when you consider that sociopathy affects roughly the same number of people who suffer from depressive and borderline personality and bipolar disorders. I did a lot of cognitive journaling, which is basically you write a thought you're having and then you write a counter thought. So it sort of forces you to take a look at any irrational belief systems you have. And I had an irrational belief system that if I don't act out, my compulsion to act out will grow stronger and it will overpower me. So it was, if I don't act out, I might be overcome by a compulsion to act out very destructively. And the counter thought is, if I don't act out, I might be uncomfortable, but I can process this differently. And that ended up being the more accurate construct like taking place. And once I understood, no, actually that's not the case, it made me feel better, and it made my destructive urges so much easier to control. It was, okay, so you're normalizing what's going on with me. You're not normalizing the behavior, and that's something I want to be really clear on. At no point do I ever want to romanticize sociopathy or normalize the destructive behavior that so many people with sociopathy engage in. What I do want to normalize is the psychological, the lack of emotional affect, and that felt really good to have somebody say, the way you feel or don't feel is very normal for someone like you. I don't have that desire to engage in pleasure the way that neurotypical people seem to. So I put it off, and then I put it off, and then I put it off. And then I find that the longer I put it off, the closer I get to getting what I can only imagine is something like a dopamine hit. If I drink a lot of water and I have to go to the bathroom, I will avoid going to the bathroom for as long as possible. I don't know that I would say I enjoy being a pleasure delayer. I can't speak to the specifics of why, and this isn't a choice that I'm making consciously. It's like, I'll do it in a minute, I'll do it in a minute, I'll do it in a minute. And I have done this so many times to the point where I have peed my pants multiple times because I just don't go to the bathroom when I'm supposed to go to the bathroom like a sane person. So I was at the White House for an event, and my husband and I were, this was the White House. It's cool. It's fun. And I was wandering around and I knew I had to go to the bathroom. I was like fidgety. And my husband was like, do you have to go to the bathroom? I was like, no, it's fine. Yes, but it's fine. I'll go in a minute. And we kept going. We were wandering. And I was not asking to use the restroom, which is what I should have done. And we finally get to this place in the White House where we're supposed to be. We're gathering for this event. And that's when I realized I have to go to the bathroom right now. As this lovely woman launched into a rendition of the national anthem, I was like, I'm just going to pee my pants at the White House. That's what's going to happen. And I did. And my husband very sweetly recognized what was happening. And he was like, are you pissing your pants at the White House? And yes, sure am. He took off his blazer and he wrapped it around my waist so that nobody would see. No, we did not stay much longer after that because I don't know how much experience you have in urinating yourself, but it's one of the most uncomfortable experiences to be just standing in a suit soaked in your own urine. According to the PCL, which is the gold standard for psychopathic, sociopathic testing, you're looking at someone who has a limited emotional affect. And that's really, really key because so much of a sociopath is defined by their behavior, the quote unquote bad things they do. But really, I think the focus should be on this limited low affect. You're going to see a lot of pathological lying, a lot of manipulation, superficial charm, lack of remorse or guilt. Parasitic lifestyle is often something that's associated with sociopathy, irresponsibility, criminal versatility. But these behaviors are problematic because not every sociopath acts that way. Psychopaths are believed to suffer from a biological abnormality that makes it impossible for them to progress through complex emotional development. So they never learn things like shame, guilt, or remorse. They can't course correct. They have trouble with impulse control. That is different from a sociopath who is believed to be capable of experiencing these emotions. They just struggle to do so. There's no real consensus on why. The prevailing theory is that psychopathy is the result of biology, whereas sociopathy is the result of environmental traumas or a temperament that sort of predisposes a child to be sociopathic, but can be sort of coaxed out of it with therapy and different coping mechanisms. This inability to connect with these learned emotions put me in this position where I felt as though I had to fake it. And that contributed to a lot of destructive behavior. It was essentially a maladaptive coping mechanism that developed into a lifestyle. I think that people feel safer believing that sociopaths are one-dimensional, dangerous monsters that you could see coming from miles away. Almost without exception, every single person that I have told I am a sociopath, they lean in. They want to be closer to me. They want to know more. They want to hear everything about it. And then they want to start talking about their darkness. Well, I've always wondered if I'm a sociopath because of this, or I want to hear about this person who I think they're interested in it. No one has ever clutched their pearls and run shrieking in the other direction. It's always been the opposite. Everyone has a darkness that they have labeled as bad. But when you get around someone like me who ostensibly doesn't have any judgment, they see it as an opportunity to unburden themselves. Like, oh, I can talk to this person. They're not going to judge me for these thoughts that I've had or these things that I've done. I find that really delightful and also a little bit sad in that I want to lean over and say, you don't have to feel bad about all this stuff. You can just drop it. You can just be yourself and it's going to be fine. But 9 times out of 10, they don't feel that they can. They don't feel that they can admit to feeling a certain way or behaving a certain way without a tremendous amount of backlash, either self-inflicted or otherwise. Every single bit of my decision to pursue a doctorate in clinical psychology was motivated by sociopathy. But what I found out was, in order to get your doctorate in psychology, you have to study other personality types too. And I wasn't interested at all. I was selfishly motivated. I wanted to help me and maybe others like me. I was able to understand the human condition in a way that I don't think I ever would have been able to otherwise. And it made things very black and white for me. It was, oh, this person acts this way because of this. That type of person acts that way because of that. It helped me understand concepts like guilt and empathy better. I didn't connect to them emotionally, but I could understand them intellectually, especially when I had to start seeing patients, which is not something I wanted to do, and I tried to get out of it in every way possible. But what I found was it was similar to breaking and entering, only I was in people's minds, and they were allowing me, obviously. But it was, wow, I don't have to have an emotional reaction to do this work. I don't have to have empathy, which sounds crazy coming from a therapist, but I think it's interesting that people always want to know, does my therapist really like me? Does my therapist hate me? What does my therapist think of me? And my answer is, do you wonder that of your oncologist? Do you wonder that of your primary care physician? Probably not. And I think the same should be said about your therapist. It's not my job to like you. It's not my job to empathize with you. It's my job to help you. It's my job to observe the things you're telling me and help you figure things out. And once I got that, and I realized how unemotional psychology could be, ironically, it really shifted the way that I perceived just humans in general. Something I noticed about people is darkness is extremely relatable, and everyone has an element of sociopathy within them. It's a matter of navigating through the guilt in order to get them to admit it and accept it and be okay with it. And so much of society, I feel, is overly burdened by guilt, having thoughts they quote unquote shouldn't be having feelings they quote unquote shouldn't be having. And I think getting people to be more accepting of their darkness is healthy. And that was something I really tried to do when I was working as a therapist, to get people to stop judging themselves for having negative thoughts or negative feelings. There's perks to being a sociopath, not to glorify the disorder, but the ability to operate outside of emotion, the ability to not be guilted into things, the lack of people pleasing. I think when you're people pleasing, you're operating from a place of need. I need someone else's approval in order to justify this decision or in order to feel good. And I've never benefited from other people's approval, which again is not to say that if I'm doing a job and my supervisor likes what I'm doing, obviously that's a good thing. But I don't make decisions based on a need to be liked. And I don't think that anyone should be making decisions based on a need to be liked. Certainly, I would prefer to be liked. I would prefer to get along with people. But I think when you are making choices because you need someone else's approval, it's potentially problematic for a large host of reasons. Most of my friends and family understood. They all knew that I was different. My husband is a perfect example. He lived through most of this with me. And yet it wasn't until it was in a book that he was able to say, oh, I understand this differently. He would take my actions or inactions personally, as if I just loved her more or loved her better, she would feel differently or react differently. And I think now he understands, oh, this actually really has nothing to do with me. And so when I was dating others, I think I would go into different relationships thinking, maybe this is going to be the relationship that gets me to the emotional point that I seem to be lacking. And they never did. Now, what I have come to understand is they never would, because it wasn't about the other person. It's what I was working with. But I didn't get that then. I would end up being frustrated and ending up having to mask a lot in relationships, faking emotions that I wasn't having, faking experiences that I wasn't having. And it was very lonely. I think one of the reasons that my relationship with David was so special so quickly was because he was one of the only people that I did reveal myself to when I was a kid. We met in a summer camp just before going into high school. And we dated for that summer. And then we broke up. He went off to college. And we kept in touch and then reconnected in my 20s. I had to do a lot of, work. I had to do a lot of figuring things out, and so did he. So when we reconnected, I think that it speaks to his patience that he was able to sort of understand and help me manage a lot of this stuff. But I remember sitting with David, and I really was just extremely candid about I didn't feel things and I didn't experience guilt, and I kept waiting to get the look from David, but I never did. Really, for the first time, I could have some semblance of a normal life if I chose a person like this with whom to spend my life. I would never have to mask. I could just be myself. He didn't like that I had these destructive urges. He didn't like that I was breaking into homes, go figure. And we had to work through it. But he also had to understand that any coping mechanism I came up with, even if it was a positive one, wasn't going to increase my affect. I was never going to be as affectionate as he is. My husband is very affectionate. He's very emotional. So for him, when I wasn't affectionate, when I wasn't emotional, he was taking it personally, as if this was a choice I was making. I'm not being affectionate with you, or I don't have these emotions the way that you have these emotions. But what he needed to understand is my emotional experience is different than yours. My love is different, but that doesn't mean it doesn't count. I'm never going to match your emotional intensity. I just don't have it. It's not because I don't love you. It's because I don't have that intensity that you have. Our journey to becoming the solid couple that we are today was relatable in the sense that we had to do a lot of therapeutic work. And I think that the more people engage in therapy and the more people engage in getting to know themselves, first and foremost, the better partners that they will be for who they choose to spend their life with. My kids are younger. The conversation is a bit adult for them. They understand the word sociopath, but I have explained it to them using a more complete definition. Certainly they know about this book. They know about that word. They certainly are going to grow up with a different understanding of the word than their friends. But they see me as someone who is less emotional than daddy. But I've noticed with neurotypical parents is that so much of their reaction to things is sort of built into how they parent. The neurotypical parent suffers from a lot of guilt and a lot of second guessing with parenting, and I don't seem to have that, which isn't to say that if I make a mistake, I'm not upset about it, but I don't really experience a lot of guilt with my kids, and I don't ever use guilt with my kids. Let's say my oldest comes home, he has a bad grade on the test. His father is going to be frustrated, and how could this have happened? You studied, and doesn't this matter to you? And we have to do better. Whereas I don't have that reaction, but I also know that that allows my child to have their reaction to the test. So, and I find that in parenting, so much of a kid is having to navigate their parents' response to something as opposed to being able to process and deal with their reaction to what happened. So I might say, yeah, this is a bad grade. How do you feel about it? And then we have the conversation about how my child feels about it as opposed to how I feel. He's not having to deal with my disappointment, which again, it doesn't mean that I don't care about his poor performance. It's just that my feeling about it takes a far backseat to his feeling about it, which I think is better in a way. My son recently wrote a speech on FOMO, fear of missing out. And he wanted me to weigh in on it. And I was able to have that conversation with him, which is, this is actually something mommy has never experienced or doesn't experience, but you do. And it's so interesting that you can process it to the extent that you can write a speech about the fear of missing out, where it comes from, how it impacts your life, and how interesting is it that we can come to this topic from two very different places. When you're talking about sociopaths in fiction, I think that it can be detrimental in that it perpetuates this very one-dimensional composite. The first thing that people think about neurotypical people anyway, my understanding is fear. and monster, serial killer. These are all largely negative associations, when in fact, sociopathy is just a personality disorder, and it deserves to be understood beyond the sensational one-dimensional characterizations that it's become largely known for. You know, you're showing these people as being singularly bad with no ability to feel, period, and that's not accurate. And when you are someone who sees themselves in a sociopathic checklist, but everywhere you look, the sociopath is portrayed as someone horrible, why on earth would you ever admit to that? It makes it more difficult for people like me to speak up. And I mean, even as a child, I understood kids who say they don't feel remorse are blackballed and cast aside and not involved in things that they should be involved in. If people understood that sociopathy is so much more than these extreme characterizations, there would be more compassion and there would be more treatment. Wednesday Addams is sociopathic. She meets most of the criteria. She's criminally versatile. She has trouble making and forming bonds. She has a low affect. She is manipulative. She's cunning. She's extremely charming. And yet I believe that Wednesday Addams offers a much more complete version of the sociopathic profile, because in addition to all of those quote unquote bad things, she's also capable of experiencing grief. She struggles to form bonds, but she can do it. She's very loyal to her friends. She is very loving to her family members. And that piece of the puzzle is largely missing in the overall understanding of sociopathy. You see that she can feel, she feels deeply. She feels differently than a neurotypical person does, but that doesn't mean her feelings don't count. And I found that parents who watch that show with their children who resonate with my story, it opens up a narrative for them that goes beyond that monster stereotype. And it's nice for these kids to see themselves represented by something other than a dangerous criminal. I enjoyed seeing all the Wednesdays knocking on my door for Halloween, and not just in her costume, but they were mimicking her flat affect. They weren't smiling when smiled at, and I thought that was so liberating, not just for me, but for them. I wanted to say, I bet it feels good to, to be bad little Wednesday. You're not doing anything overtly cruel or bad, but you don't have to play by the rules, if only for tonight. Giving these kids the space to say, I actually don't feel much, and that's okay. They're allowed to have a different emotional experience than you, and they should be allowed to be honest about their experience. I was able to talk to my kids about that personality through the Wednesday lens, and it could not have come at a better time for me to have that conversation. It's not just Wednesday, though. There are so many characters, fictional characters, that are sociopathic that I think the general public takes for granted. They don't realize that they're rooting for the sociopathic character. Elphaba, I remember reading Wicked, the book, and really resonating with that, with this character who is believed to be bad just because she has a different experience of the world. I actually really appreciated the Dexter character because I saw myself in that strategy. Obviously, I wasn't murdering people, but what he was doing is he was experiencing a need to act out, and he decided to channel that need into essentially being a vigilante that shed more light on a fuller composite. This is someone who is capable of having a relationship. He's capable of love. He loves his sister. He cares for his wife. He cared for his kids, perhaps not in the way a neurotypical person does, but he was capable of leading a high-functioning life. So I appreciated that it wasn't a bloodlust story. It wasn't someone that was getting off on hurting people for hurting people's sake. Larry David, I mean, this is a character that everybody loves. And what does he do? He acts antisocially 90% of the time. He doesn't have much of an affect. He doesn't seem to have a great deal of empathy. And yet we root for him. We love him. I think that as a society, we are far more comfortable rooting for a sociopathic fictional character. But what that tells me is unconsciously, we're ready to root for the non-fiction people too. We just need more information in order to get there. We need to see them as more complete individuals in order to do that. Roughly 5% of the population are sociopathic. The research indicates that it's right around 4 or 5%. But when you consider that the diagnostics for sociopathy and psychopathy are largely conducted within the prison system, my belief is that that is a very conservative estimate. If there was more testing available for this personality disorder, I would bet that the prevalence would be higher than 4 or 5%. When I've been contacted by parents or others who resonate with my story and they're looking for help, the first thing I say is ask your child or yourself, what does it feel like when you feel? Because that's really the key. You'll find that a lot of these people, they don't connect with these social emotions, and that ends up driving them to act out compulsively. If we're only looking at the behavior, I think a lot of people who are on the mild to moderate side of the sociopathic spectrum will fall through the cracks, because not everybody is acting out really aggressively or extremely. As soon as a child starts acting out antisocially, get them in therapy and ask them, what does it feel like when you feel? Because so much of therapy is dedicated to behavioral, which makes sense. If you have a child or an adult that's acting out antisocially or destructively, you want to stop that behavior first and foremost. But that's just the beginning. One of the things that I always like to suggest is that they watch the latest iteration of the Wednesday Addams series on Netflix. Ask your child, what does it feel like when you feel? And chances are, the Wednesday story gives those kids the tools to answer that question. To be clear, you can't diagnose a juvenile as sociopathic or psychopathic, but you don't even want oppositional defiant disorder, early onset conduct disorder. These are red flags. These are the sort of precursors to sociopathy, and no parent wants that for their kid, and I understand. This is such a hypocrisy in that sociopath is thrown around mercilessly to describe every manner of evil, and yet everybody claims to know a sociopath. Everybody claims to have dated a sociopath. Everybody loves the sociopath shows. And when I have had conversations with these people, all they want to do is unburden themselves and find a way to normalize what they perceive as sociopathic behavior. But I've got news for you. This isn't sociopathic behavior. This is the human condition. How does feeling feel like for you? I think that's a very benign and evolved way to have that conversation, as opposed to, I think you might be a sociopath. Even someone who does identify with a sociopathic checklist is going to probably be defensive if somebody says that, because of the way that that word is used incorrectly. But how does feeling feel like for you is not a question I think is asked enough. And it could be that your partner is experiencing emotion differently than you are, and that no one has ever bothered to ask. And I think that at the very least, feeling seen, feeling like you have a safe space to explore how you experience emotion is a wonderful place to start. I didn't want my memoir to be a glamorization of this personality type. My goal in writing the book was, I wanted people like me to feel seen. And I wanted to offer a humanized take on a dehumanized disorder. It's really easy when you are writing off a huge group of people as monsters to just discount everything about them. But when you can put the face of a child on it, when you can put the face of a mother, a wife, someone who is living a high functioning life, that changes the landscape a little bit. And I wanted others like me to see themselves represented by something other than a serial killer. I wanted to give them hope for a happy, loving relationship, motherhood if they choose, friendships. I mean, these things are very possible for someone with sociopathy if they're given the tools and the space to learn. I don't think it's as interesting to the public as the monster serial killer definition that everyone's fond of. If you don't trust me, if you don't feel that you can trust me, don't. Go out and do the research yourself. You know, I've said this before, if everybody who came across my story went out and fact-checked the research, I think that in itself would shift the narrative. You don't have to believe me. Believe the research. Believe the other researchers. Believe the Society for the Scientific Study of Psychopathy. Believe them. It's not about me. It's about sociopathy and those struggling to get treatment. And I feel that if more people understood the research, it wouldn't matter who was telling the story, because the research is really the most important part. The real work is, let's get into the affect. I would love to reclassify this disorder, psychopathy and sociopathy, as low affect disorder. It's such a wonderful name because sociopath, psychopath, those are so stigmatized and they are so activating. Whereas low affect disorder, it speaks directly to the psychological underpinnings of the behavior. Well, I think that's happened a lot in psychology. Look at mental retardation, for instance. You would never use that word today, and yet that was a clinical diagnosis for a long time. And then they changed it because it had become so negatively stigmatized, rightfully so. Multiple personality disorder, that's another one that they replaced with a different name, specifically because it had become too stigmatized. Why can't they do that for psychopathy or sociopathy? As long as we continue to identify it based only on the most extreme examples, we're not going to get anywhere in terms of treatment or understanding. And the research also indicates that the majority of people who fall on the sociopathic spectrum fall on the mild to moderate side. And there's a lot of disagreement on how to test and where individuals who fall on that lower end of the spectrum, what they should be labeled as. There should be more consistency, because if you're talking about a disorder that represents millions of people, and most of those people fall on the mild to moderate side of the spectrum, we should have a working treatment plan, a working diagnostic kit. We should have things that are available, well, certainly more available than they are now. In terms of a general treatment plan, I don't think that we're much closer, but I think we're getting there. And I think because more people are speaking about psychopathy and antisocial personality disorders and because they're speaking about them at a younger age, again, this speaks to that ability to feel more compassion for someone who is antisocial if they are a child or if they are younger. When a child is acting out, you don't want to throw them in prison, and even if you did, you can't. You have to find ways to deal with it.
Hi, I'm a producer and authorised account. If you enjoyed this video, then please subscribe and comment with more topics that you'd like us to cover in this series.